Welcome to the European Equation.
Join us as we analyze the critical issues that shape the future of the European continent.
We are your hosts, Stanislas Salivert
and Till Gosch. Hi Stan.
Hello, Till.
How are you doing?
I am doing quite well. It's been a minute.
Since our last episode, Europe hasn't stood still necessarily.
Very much not.
Yeah, there are some things that happened. I remember the peace talks in Ukraine with the new Trump administration. We talked about Greenland, but since then there's been a lot of things happening on the European continent. So
absolutely. I mean, just beyond that, there's also been the whole trade tensions with Trump's tariffs, which are rolling forwards and backwards, it seems. There's also been a couple of developments, although I think that was maybe a little bit earlier with the CSRD and the Omnibus package, which is looking to basically pull back a lot of the sustainability reforms that the EU had agreed on in previous years. So, I mean, a lot of things have been happening.
But today, we're not here to discuss these topics, but instead we're talking about defense procurement in the European Union.
Exactly, and with a Danish perspective. But I think, actually, before we mention who our fantastic guest this week is, we wanted to give perhaps a little bit of intro into the topic, because defense, from the way I see it and the way we've been reading about it, has always been a very complex matter. Beyond having a soldier on the front line, there lies basically a multitude of different levels and puzzle pieces that all need to fit together. From logistics to communication and coordination to ensuring that your recruits are actually properly trained and that there's political willpower as well on having these troops on the ground. These all basically play a very critical role. And I mean, then we did a bit of digging and we found as well some frameworks. So we're going to briefly touch upon that. But some defense experts have formalized these into what they call the fundamental inputs to capabilities. These are basically all the elements a military needs to actually deliver a capability, not just own the piece of gear. That includes not only the equipment, but also the personnel to operate it, the organization to support it, facilitate and house it, the command and control systems, the maintenance structures. I mean, that list really, really goes on.
Yeah, I think a good example is if you buy like a cutting-edge fighter jet like the F-35 Lightning II, but you don't have trained pilots, the airfields to base them on, or the logistics to maintain them, then you're not actually buying air defense. You're just mostly contributing to Lockheed Martin's quarterly earnings. But for the purpose of this conversation, we do want to zoom in on just this one key part of the broader picture, and that is procurement. So the process of how governments procure high-end military equipment that their armed forces will actually fight with. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we want to discuss that topic at the intersection of Europe's push towards greater strategic autonomy, the current pitfalls within it, and the ambitious defense initiatives proposed by the European leaders. And for that purpose, we are talking to someone that is working in the field of defense procurement, and that is Major Aske Nerup, Chief of the Danish Defense Industrial Office at DALO. So welcome, Aske, and thank you for taking the time and joining us for this episode.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aske.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, we're really excited about this conversation. But I think before we go into the nitty-gritty of all of that, we'd love it if you could actually just quickly introduce yourself, share a little bit about your professional background, what inspired you to have your career that you have today, and what your work today at the Danish Defense Industrial Office consists of.
Yeah, right, sure. I'm an army officer. What inspired me? I mean, I don't think I had inspiration for it. So in Denmark, we have a mandatory military service for men, and in a minute for women as well. I joined up because I had nothing better to do in that gap year after high school, and I think I just said yes sir too many times. And now it's been almost 2 decades. So I just hung around. And it got me to where I am now. So I've worked with defense procurement, capability planning, industry, international armaments, cooperation within that field for the past about 8 years. I've worked a lot with the EU, so starting up the European Defence Fund as the national representative in that program. And of course, for the past 3 years, Ukraine has been a big thing, a big ticket item for us. In my previous job, I've been in the current job for a little over a year now. My previous job, I was at the Ministry of Defense, working with Ukrainian donations and stuff like that. And before all of that, I had a glorious career in the army for about 8 years, where I've deployed to Afghanistan, and I worked at a NATO headquarters, and I've been a logistics officer and stuff like that. So yeah, I'd say a broad career in about 18 years of service, and I'm enjoying it. And the work at the Defense Industrial Office, really it's about security of supply. So enhancing our chance to have access to technology and capabilities in crisis and in war, which is not always easy. I think we learned that during COVID. Actually, it's a funny thing. So the first country to come and aid Europe on masks and hand sanitizer was China. I think when our requirements are ammunition and fuel and stuff, I don't think China will be the first one to send cargo aircraft to us. I think we have to probably build it ourselves. Maybe that's the main sentiment around the Defense Industrial Office. We try to shorten the distance between the armed forces and the providers, not necessarily physically, but through cooperation. So that's our main task at the Industry Office. Yeah.
Okay, let's maybe stick with that really quick and talk a little about the means that you use to secure procurement. You just mentioned reducing the distance between the armed forces and the providers through cooperation, but what other levers do you pull when you are talking about securing procurement?
Yeah, so at my office, we work with predominantly 3 levers on this endeavor. So of course, we try to minimize the distance between the armed forces and industry. So it's about dialogue and cooperation. So that's the first lever. And then supporting exports. So that's from the Danish companies to strengthen our own defense industrial base. We've got to push our companies abroad. The Danish defense industrial sector, their revenue, about 90% would be from exports, because Denmark is a small buyer. Like, although we are investing a lot of money in defense, we're still a small buyer, so we gotta push them abroad. And then we do industrial cooperation, also called offsets. So whenever we procure something from a foreign supplier, military equipment worth a certain amount of money, then we can put an offset requirement on the provider to do investments back into the Danish defense industry, and that's something my office handles as well. Besides that, we are very much engaged with the defense industrial strategy, so the national strategy to build defense industrial capability. There's a strategy from 21. A lot has happened since 21. I think most of the premise of the strategy has been altered, to say the least. Denmark's entry into European defense politics, war in Ukraine, whatever's going on with the US right now. So we're doing a revision of the defense industrial strategy in my office is a key part in that. And then also as a newer thing, we are trying to attract foreign defense investments to Denmark. It could be Ukrainian. There's a special emphasis on getting Ukrainian companies to the West and to Denmark to make them investable. But also any other foreign country who would like to set up shop in Denmark. We're working on welcoming them, rolling out the red carpet.
So you've already briefly touched a little bit about how, from a procurement perspective, Denmark is a small buyer, but at the same time, it's trying to export a lot. I mean, then specifically with the Danish military industrial complex, what role do you see it play within European defense? And how have you guys been trying to position yourself, so to speak, within that? Because, I mean, of course, Denmark can't do everything.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it's a good question, really, because we don't do this work alone. So it's the Ministry of Defense. Of course, we perceive ourselves as detrimental in setting the tone of where our defense industry should go, but it's also Ministry of Business, and it's Foreign Affairs, it's Finance. And I think sometimes people just see, creating more jobs and stuff like that, right? And then maybe we should try to build like the next Rheinmetall in Denmark. Let's have a Danish Rheinmetall. And I'm not quite sure that Denmark needs that or should have that. So the Danish defense industrial base, it's growing, but it's underdeveloped if you look at peers around Europe. I mean, countries who we normally would compare ourselves to, like Sweden. Sweden has a huge defense industrial sector. Finland, it's big. The Baltics, it's bigger. Netherlands. So the countries we usually compare ourselves with, they're outrunning us on the defense sector. But it's very capable, the Danish defense industry. I think it's because of the size. So they're really good at integrating. So maybe Denmark and the Danish defense industry to be an integrator into larger systems. I think that'd be a good role for Denmark to play. We're easy to work with as a country and our companies. And we're a great place to invest if you're a foreign defense company, especially from outside EU. If you're an American company and you can see what's going on now, like a Fortress America and a Fortress Europe, and maybe Europe is not going to be as inclined to procure American stuff. If you're an American company, you want a European company, right? But there's no chance you're going to set up in France. They'll strangle you by, national interest, right? You probably can't set up, or it'd be difficult in the other Nordic countries because there's a lot of government and state ownership. In Germany, it's a heavy interest around the industry there. And in the southern parts of Europe, they don't really spend anything on defense. So Denmark's actually a good place to do it.
Is it then a very privatized model, or compared to being state?
Yeah. So the Danish defense industry are 100% private. So there is no publicly listed companies. There's no state ownership. It's mostly family offices or private investments that are running it and owning it. Yeah.
Okay. And you said that Denmark was also a bit of an integrator. How do we see that reflected maybe in its in what it produces? What actually are basically what we produce?
I mean,
to a certain degree?
Before we start recording, we were talking about the F-35 program, and Denmark actually plays quite a significant role in the F-35 program. We've got a company delivering composite materials and stuff like that actually goes into the aircraft. We've got companies that are great at integrating data into command and control systems. We've got a company that delivers to most of NATO, I would think, even to the US, the German army as well. We've got great technology companies building the enablers. The space industry, I mean, we actually do have companies that can build micro satellites, but really they're good at building the sensors and the technology that goes into satellites. And I mean, it's as any other country, I would say, within unmanned technologies, we're doing quite well, both on countering drones, but also building and producing the technology that goes into it, also the actual drones. It's if you're speaking about size, I think originally we would look at maybe a core of the Danish defense industry of about maybe 30 to 50 companies where the majority of their revenue comes from defense. But I mean, I'd say maybe 500 would be delivering to defense, maybe as their primary business model, but as a growing part. So we see a big interest in companies actually wanting to divest in their commercial product and try to go into defense, probably because it's good business. But I mean, I would hope that some of the countries also, or the companies would also look at it as we're doing something. It's a whole of society effort to create national security, right?
Yeah, you just touched upon how intertwined the defense industry is, and for example, us Denmark supplying technology that goes into satellites. And when we now look at the situation that evolved with the second Donald Trump administration, I feel one major topic or obstacle on greater European defense autonomy is the ITAR issue. So the U.S. international traffic in arms regulations. And because they can, through ITAR, the US can exercise significant control over how allied countries use or transfer systems. So, for example, we had this back in 2018 when the US was able to block the transfer of the French Rafale with the Scalp cruise missiles to Egypt, even though there was just a minimal part within that missile. Or like recently when Germany had to approve Poland's transfer of the Leopard 2s. So if European countries want more strategic autonomy, they need systems that aren't like that dependent on the US or those approval processes. So what do you think would it take for Europe, or like also Denmark in this case, to reduce this kind of dependency?
It's a tough one. I mean, say what you want, but the Americans are good at producing high-end military equipment, especially the tier 1 larger stuff, aircraft. And it's a lot of the stuff that's ITAR regulated. It's goes into, for instance, electronic warfare, because those are often highly classified. So they would be concerned of like who gets this into their hands, and it's just difficult. I mean, you're not going to fly a fighter aircraft with subpar electronic warfare. I mean, you're just not going to do it. But I think we have to look at ourselves as well. So, I mean, we don't have a similar thing as an ITAR regulation, but we have export control. So Denmark has a list of countries that we are prohibited from exporting defense equipment to. And I remember a case from last year where the UK were to modernize I can't recall the aircraft type. They were Typhoon aircrafts. Yeah, it could be. The US were modifying aircraft for Saudi Arabia because the Saudis have bought these UK made aircraft. And a component in that aircraft is from a Danish manufacturer. But Saudi Arabia is on that list of countries that we can't export to. So now Denmark was blocking Saudi Arabia's usage of these aircraft, and obviously the UK were unsatisfied with this, because what was the issue there was if this Middle Eastern country can't get access to Western weapons, it's just going to go to China, and then there's this pull of which hemisphere is pulling the most in some of these, call it contended or contested areas. So I mean, we've got some issues as well. Austria. So Denmark wanted to donate armored vehicles to Ukraine at the beginning of the war, but they were procured in Austria, and the Austrian government said no, because they wanted to remain neutral, which it became a big thing and a big political thing. I remember meeting with the representative from the company at a conference in Brussels. And really, I think it was definitely out of my mandate, but at that time, and still now, I mean, we're looking to procure more armored vehicles, and we have a ton of these vehicles from this supplier. And I mean, we want agency, like full agency on what we do with the military equipment that we buy. So I told them, I mean, it's not my decision, but if it were, then I would be very reluctant on procuring more equipment from you guys if we don't have this agency. And 2 weeks later we got the approval to donate. It was about 20 vehicles, maybe a bit less, so it wasn't like a big thing, but so within Europe and within the European continent, we also put these regulations on ourselves. But I think it's difficult to make the investment into the R&D that it takes to counter this equipment that's ITAR regulated, especially on the electronic warfare scene. It's very sophisticated, and the Americans are very good at doing it.
I think R&D is a really relevant keyword here, especially because the defense industry is extremely R&D intensive. Just take the example of the new Panther tank. The technology that goes into it is incredibly advanced, and that naturally drives up the costs. Because of that, it's often financially not viable for defense firms to pursue R&D on their own, so they tend to follow the specific requirements set by the state. That puts, of course, a lot of responsibility on the governments to define very clear and precise needs. At the same time, with warfare and military technology constantly evolving, R&D becomes crucial to maintaining effective defense capabilities. So my question is, how big of an obstacle is it to secure R&D investments in the defense sector and ensure that our capabilities keep pace with the evolving nature of warfare?
They do R&D, and some of it is state funded. I mentioned the European Defence Fund. That's something I worked with previously, and the whole purpose of that fund is to provide R&D support to companies. If you're a smaller company and you're working with something more upstream, you get a higher percentage of your costs covered. And of course, if you're a larger company and you're only doing the final twerks, then you get less. But there, the EU set aside 8 billion euros to fund R&D in defense, also on research, so a bit earlier. I think we do pay for the R&D. It's just not in the contract. There's an overhead when we buy something. It's quite big. And that's to pay for the R&D that's gone into it. I think I heard somewhere, I haven't verified it, but some more sophisticated systems, air defense, stuff like that, I think the profit margins are like 600 to 700% of what it costs to actually produce the thing. And the argument from industry is that it's all the R&D that goes into it. If you think of it, so building a missile or an aircraft, it takes 15, 20, 30 years to develop. It's a lot of cost that goes into it, a lot of personnel, a lot of material, a lot of testing, a lot of certifications, and there's a lot of risk. Again, you mentioned the specific requirements, and the armed forces are masters at putting requirements to industry. And we are so good at it that we quite often miss the mark. You'd be surprised if you look at some of our perhaps older contracts or tenders on, you could have multiple pages of requirements. And it's not requirements that it'd be nice if you could. It's like, can you do it or not? If you say no, then you're out. Then you're not going to be able to make a bid. And that makes it quite difficult for providers, especially in Europe, because a European defense industrial company, they cater to a multitude of companies. If you're an American company, 80% of your income is going to come from the American government, so you're just going to please the American government, and then everyone else, they can get their scraps right. European defense company, it's different. You got to cater to a broader market. You've got Germany, you've got France, you've got Denmark, you've got Netherlands, with all different requirements. Some will be identical, but there'll be so many different requirements. So everyone needs a special .dk solution, and they just adds to the cost. You go anywhere to a car dealership, you buy a car, but then you want all the extras. Right? And you're just gonna pay for it, and especially with all these extras, it doesn't come with a model. You have to has to be welded on or something. It's extra costs, and it's extra risk, right? And who pays for the risk? It's the armed forces. We pay for it.
Yeah, so then you're touching a little bit on it, this whole idea of gold plating and how the armies want to have something that's exactly for their needs. So in essence, it feels also a little bit like they're replicating efforts too many times. And in that dimension, actually, Europe, it seems, has too many different standards, if that makes sense. And if I take a quick example, we've got, for example, 19 main battle tanks versus 1 for the US. So, my question is, beyond that, EU programs have tried to tackle this a little bit by avoiding these replicating efforts through particularly joint procurement initiatives. My question to you in this is, are these programs actually going far enough, or do you see limitations? And as well, building on that, can broader initiatives like Rearm Europe, where we try to unlock funding through high allowances or debt ceilings for the army, can these help rearm Europe, and can these help support these joint procurement programs, or does that in itself also have its own limitations?
Yeah, I think definitely joint procurement is a way out. I wouldn't say joint procurement as in all EU member states buy the same thing, because that's just not feasible, and the circumstance it needs to operate in, and it needs to be interoperable with other stuff. So, but again, going back to if everyone has unique items that are uniquely developed to each country's requirements, one thing is on an operational side, it's very difficult to get these systems to talk together. It's difficult enough within one nation state, but then you just add more players in, and it becomes like vastly more difficult. But also to streamline our production. Again, I mean, you mentioned the main battle tank part. I think 17 or 19, but I think sometimes they count like the different Leopard tanks as different. I mean, some of them are quite different. But even like Denmark and Norway, I think it's like an equal level of upgrade. I mean, we've procured upgrades continuously. They're vastly different tanks. I mean, you probably could take a Danish crew into a Norwegian tank, but they can't operate it 100%. So I think it comes down to countries, just taking a step back and saying, maybe we don't need the unique product. Maybe we need the product that's on the shelves, and we'll just make it work. And if everyone does that, I think we'll get something cheaper, because you don't have to add like the extra 20% of odd requirements. But sometimes there will be requirements. So in the Nordics, we like things to be able to operate in extreme climates. Then maybe Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, maybe we'll go together and we'll do something jointly. The same could be said for the southernmost countries. I think joint procurement is definitely a thing that we're working towards in the EU setting, because there are instruments to try to incentivize member states to go that route. But really, we've been practicing in the Nordic Forum for quite a bit. I wouldn't say we've been vastly successful. I mean, until now we've managed to buy uniforms. It only took 10 years to agree on how they should look and how they should fit and stuff like that. Who owns what? But it's a start. And I think we've recently done a couple of other acquisitions, but it's very difficult. Again, I mean, you say, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. I mean, surely you guys, you can figure it out. Like you share the language, you share culture, you share somewhat of an operational environment, but still in that setting, very difficult. And then try to include a country like France or Spain or Greece. It's not going to get easy, I think. But really it comes down to accepting an 80% solution and just go with the standard product. I mean, it's also easier for industry. For the rearm, it was a big day, I think, for Europe after the small summit. But as so much with Europe, and I mean, I didn't work in Brussels, but I was in Brussels once or twice a month for 3 years straight. So I spent a lot of time in the EU. And there's a lot of talk, and here it looked like there's some action, but there's a lot of caveats on that action. I think the assumptions from von der Leyen on the 800 billion, I think it's a heroic assumption. I mean, that would every country utilize the removal of the debt ceiling? I'm not sure. Do we talk about cost sharing or burden sharing? Is the richer northern parts of Europe, are we ready to shoulder that burden for the poorer southern parts? Especially looking at how defense procurements and defense investments are being done right now. I think Spain and Italy, they're still lagging like substantially behind on defense investments, whereas in the Nordics and the Baltics, we've upped our defense spendings quite significantly. Denmark almost doubled our defense spendings over the past few years. So I think Europe has to realize, like, are we ready to shoulder that burden together, and can we convince like Europe South to also pitch in? And I'm not quite sure that they would utilize the debt ceiling that rearm would. So I think 800 billion is probably going a bit too far. But I mean, the initiative has its merits, I would say, and it has been an issue with the inability to obtain more debt. It's not a problem for Denmark because we have the coffers full, but it's not the case in many other countries.
Yeah, let's maybe put a pin in the rearm topic and anything that von der Leyen was doing in the last couple of weeks. Because we also just talked about joint procurement and like working together like in Europe. And maybe when we look at that right now, like there is much of Europe's deterrence posture relies on US provided enablers.
Yeah.
So especially critical force multipliers like AWACS or air refueling tankers or any space-based systems for missile warning, reconnaissance, and communication. Of course, Europe doesn't need to be like on 1-1 parity with the US, but it does need to fill some gaps.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what are the most important capability areas where Europe needs to invest more, and what are the biggest challenges in developing those capabilities?
I think I actually mentioned it on the space capabilities. Early warning, as you mentioned, for missile defense, but I think maybe more importantly for communications. We've seen in Ukraine that traditional ways of communicating with HF and VHF radios, GPS, satellite communication, it doesn't always work. So we just need a multitude of ways to communicate, and space is one of those domains where it's difficult for the adversary to actually do anything. Especially Russia, they don't have the strongest space capabilities. So I'd say space would definitely be one. Perhaps like long strike or deep strike capabilities. The US has Tomahawk missiles that are capable of doing deep strike. Also provided from the F-35s. I mean, it's got a lot of reach. We can only operate them from bases. The US has carriers. I'm not sure that France carrier can do F-35s. Perhaps it can, maybe the UK. But the ability to strike deep as a deterrent, I think, is quite important. I believe our Chief of Defense, the Danish Chief of Defense, said something similar. I mean, defensive capabilities are good, but you can only take so much of a beating before you have to strike back. Otherwise, it's going to keep coming. So yeah, I mean, deep strike in space, I think would be quite critical for us. But that's talking about the capabilities. One of the issues that we have been seeing, we're still seeing it, and there's no easy solution, is how do we source all the material and the underlying technology that goes into these capabilities. And that's difficult. I had a meeting a few years back with a large consultancy company who had done some work for the UK Ministry of Defence. And they were ordered to look at the supply chain and go like as far downstream as they could, or as far upstream as they could, to find out like where does this stuff come from. And when the UK MOD got the report, it's like, yeah, we don't want it. Like, don't show it to us. Because like after you went like just 3, 4, 5 steps out, they didn't know. Like they had no idea where this stuff came from. So that's an issue as well. I mean, you would still find whenever they capture Russian material, they would still find Western produced stuff in it. And this is even from drones that are newly built, because it's impossible. It's almost impossible to track down everything there, right? Ukrainians have they're putting in an effort now to figure out which companies are providing this, and if these companies are outside of NATO and EU, they'll try to influence or strike these companies, like to disrupt the supply lines. So it's but once you start picking things apart, like you'll find stuff from everywhere. And there was this example I got a while back when the US put sanctions on Iran on the nuclear program. There was this, I think it's like, I don't know, this Iranian state TV, and they were showing around on one of their uranium enriching facilities that were only enriching for energy or something. And then when you froze the screen, in the background you can see equipment from the US, like with company names and everything, like going into this nuclear facility on enriching uranium. It's like, well, that's not supposed to happen, right? So it's very hard to enforce with the supply line going all the way back to actually the mines, right? And that's a challenge that the EU will have as well. We've got a multitude of companies who, they can increase their production capability of ammunition, but they can't increase it on the stuff that goes into to building the explosives. And then the EU and the European countries are as they are. I mean, heavily regulated. There was this company, I think there's about 3 companies in continental Europe that produces some of the chemicals that goes into producing the explosives for artillery. And there's one company, which I think is the only one on private hands, that is not a government company. They wanted to increase their production capacity, but they had to enlarge in their facility. And their order books were filled out for 10 years. But the local municipality couldn't allow it because there was this little stream that was going through, and then there was a risk of contamination or something, and then it was stopped. Like, this is 1 out of 3 companies that produce like core material for like defense industry, and it was stopped because of some environmental stuff, right? So we're also very good at regulating ourselves, and I think that's an issue as well. It's an issue for the US as well, but I think now they are maybe not too keen on letting regulations stop their expansions. So maybe we have to look at that as well.
Yeah, and just circling back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, actually before the recording, you said that the US was actually quite reliant on Europe for a lot of its manufacturing, or for parts of its systems. And obviously there are dependencies on both sides, because Europe is also dependent on a lot of weapons bought from the US. So one of the things that I feel like we're seeing a lot in Europe is this wish, and also in the US, that's very much still a thing, is this wish to reshore a lot of their defense capabilities. My question a little bit to you is, how realistic do you think that is? And are there any even timeframes that can be taken into account here and that could be relevant to look at?
I think the reshoring of the dependencies in US-centric defense programs to the US, I don't think anyone would win from that. There's a reason why it was offshored. There were extensive tendering programs going on, so the best sub-providers ended up winning. For many countries, Denmark included, the choice of the F-35, so when we did our evaluation of the candidates, and there were several, it depended on, of course, price, availability, quality, all the regular stuff. It also depended on strategic conditions, like with allies, but also industry. So it's like a fifth leg of our evaluation model. So we were really into, so whichever aircraft we choose and whichever provider we choose, we need to see investments going back to Denmark, because it's a huge acquisition cost. I think we spent about 16 billion kroner procuring the aircrafts, and then you've got additional contracting for where they have to park and training and upkeep and everything else. It was a huge contract for us, the biggest we have done so far. So we wanted some of that money to go back into Denmark and back into Danish jobs and stuff like that. And this goes for all the other F-35 country members. And we had the case with Turkey that was outed from the program because they bought Russian anti-aircraft equipment. And those two things, they shouldn't go together. And it took many months for the US to replace those providers, the Turkish providers, and there weren't even that many. And this was early on in the program. I mean, trying to replace, for instance, Denmark now, I don't think it's feasible, but I don't think it's probably going to drive up the cost for the American customer as well, and it's gonna reduce the odds that European countries or other foreign countries will be procuring that system. And this goes beyond the F-35 program. I mean, if Denmark and other countries begin to see potential caveats with procuring like these high-end systems, it could be HIMARS, it can be electronic warfare systems, could be surveillance aircraft, drones. If we can't count on those systems to be sustained, and if we can't put requirements on the US to make investments into Denmark, we're probably just going to go with another supplier, because we do perceive industrial cooperation and investment back into Denmark as a core feature of our evaluation model, especially now as we're talking security of supply. So really we want to create dependencies. So Denmark, I mean, we talked before about should Denmark have its own Lockheed Martin or its own Raytheon? I don't think so. It's probably not feasible, but even if it were, I'm not sure that's the best way to go about it. We're simply not big enough to have one like all-absorbing company. But we want to integrate. So say if you've got like several tiers on security of supply. So at the bottom, like what you absolutely must have, it's like uniforms, ammunition, fuel, stuff like that. And this we absolutely need to be able to produce in Denmark. And we're taking strides to do that with opening an ammunition producing facilities, stuff like that. And then you've got another tier of stuff where it'd probably be nice if you have it like in your own hands or in your backyard. It could be drones, could be rifles, could be maintenance of critical capabilities. And then you go further along up the tier list, and then at the end you've got like an F-35 aircraft. I mean, Denmark is never going to produce our own fighter aircraft. We're never going to produce our own tanks. But we need a company with a foot in the door. Like we need a dependency. So whenever there's supply issues with an F-35 and we could get pressured by the provider or the US, I mean, we've got some leverage. Like we've got a card on our hand saying, I mean, we produce like critical parts for this aircraft. I mean, we need supplies. We need us to be able to keep operating with this aircraft. Otherwise, there's a chance that we can't keep supplying to the entire fleet of aircraft. So we want a foot in the door. We want some leverage, and leverage we can get through pushing our defense industry into these supply chains. So that's also something we're very focused on. On some countries, it's easier than others. I think that was our key strategy with the European Defence Fund as well. So if the European Defence Fund would end up developing, new main systems, then we want Danish companies to have been in the R&D process and throughout, so we're part of that supply chain, because that gives us leverage. And we're a small country, we're a small buyer, and we need as much leverage as we can get.
That's interesting. So technically the strategy is not necessarily to create this like completely autonomous European defense industry, but instead like get the foot in the door and just create more dependencies.
Yeah, I mean that's from a Danish perspective.
Yeah,
I think Europe as an entity, I mean, surely has the manpower, surely has the economy and the technical know-how to become like a fortress Europe and build everything ourselves. Maybe there are some issues where, I mean, I mentioned space, but I think we probably could catch up on space. Nuclear programs, I don't know too much about nuclear programs, but I think they're very complicated. I'm not sure how much of you've got France, you've got the UK. I think the UK is heavily reliant on the US. I'm not sure about the French.
We're not really. This is a whole story. I've actually gone down this rabbit hole.
All right,
and, they've absolutely rejected everything from the Americans. The Americans actually offered to provide missile launching systems to the French back in the 70s, and they absolutely rejected it. It's thanks.
Which is probably a good thing now that they have an isolated system, right? So there are some capabilities where I think we are lagging behind. It'd be difficult to catch up, but as a whole, I think we could do fairly well as Europe. I think we're taking good strides. I mean, with few exceptions, every country is doing significant strides on increasing their defense spendings. Issue is time. I mean, that's our main sentiment as well. I mean, we need to buy stuff. We need to buy it now. So we'll buy anything that's available. And for the EU, it's the same. But again, our defense industry in Europe, and it's Denmark, I think it's most countries, it's been stagnant since the end of the Cold War, right? So for about 30-something years, right? So people have been harvesting on the peace dividend. The defense industry is underdeveloped. I mean, Russia is outproducing the entirety of the EU on artillery shells, with an economy the size of Italy, and with I suppose half the workforce, right? So we can do it. I think it's just a question of, like, do we really want to? Because our opportunity costs are way larger than Russia's. I think I heard somewhere, like, I don't know if it's true, but only half of Russia has access to, like, modern toilets, right? So it just says something about how much can the Russian people suffer before it really starts to hurt. Where in the West, I mean, as soon as the price on milk went up by 5%, it's like, let's forget about Ukraine. I mean, this is not sustainable, right? So there's a huge sensitivity to price and a huge sensitivity to all the opportunity costs that could come. I mean, are we willing to jeopardize social security, stuff like that, to build up defense capabilities? I think some countries are. A country like Denmark, because we have so much in the coffers. I mean, we haven't really seen any civil consequence in people's ordinary lives. But I'm sure if Spain or Greece were contributing to Ukraine and to the defense spending as much as we are, they would probably feel it, and then the EU would feel it. So I'm not sure that we are in the entirety ready for it. But surely we can. It's just a question of, are we willing to do it?
So looking beyond all the aspects of European security that we now have touched upon, maybe you can give us some final words of how Denmark envisions its role in the broader European defense framework by 2030, and what does the country hope to achieve in terms of its own security and contributions to European defense efforts?
I mean, I think ultimately we want to be able to defend ourselves. And that's a statement I think goes for most European countries. It's also a relatively easy statement to come with, because we can't envision a situation where we would have to solely defend ourselves as the sole defender, which is where the situation for us is quite different than what it is for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine are fighting alone. Yes, they get support, but ultimately they're fighting it alone. It looked vastly different in a NATO context or an EU context. It's so for the past 30 years, Denmark has only participated in what you can call like a war of choice. We have participated in, I think, every major conflict in NATO or coalitions for the past 20, 30 years. The Balkans, we were there in Libya, in Iraq twice, in Afghanistan. But we chose to do it. We chose the scale of our commitment, the time, how much risk we're willing to take. But now I think we're looking into a war of necessity. That's what Ukraine is doing now. I mean, you can't choose. It comes to you whether you want it or not. For Denmark, that's we need to rewire how we thought about defense. For a long time, we thought expeditionary. We thought, we just need to build these highly mobile units that we can just send out, like small units, a brigade, or not even brigade, just a battalion out to support something, and then 6 months, and then they come back, and then everything's good. Now you've got to think long term. I mean, how can we not just build and upkeep a defense capability now, but how does it look a couple of weeks into a conflict? Like, do you still have enough soldiers? Do you still have enough equipment? Do you still have enough supplies? And where are they fighting? I mean, I think we've got an idea that the army will be fighting in the Baltics, and what the Navy. I mean, I'm not sure the Baltic Sea is going to be a great place to be. So maybe in the North Atlantic somewhere, the Air Force supporting something. So where we're fighting, who we're fighting with. I think it's going to reshape how Denmark thinks about defense. But we are thinking into having a broader range of defense capabilities. I mean, back in the day, we talked about smart defense. So everyone has a piece of the puzzle. When we put everything together, like we've got just what we need. But just what we need is not enough. Like you need just that and a whole lot more. So building stockpiles, like the boring stuff that politicians don't like, just like fuel just sitting in silos, ammunition is just like being in the bunker, and then you've got to burn it when it goes old, but that's okay because that's part of it. But you can't really see it. Like it's not, here's a new ship. Okay, that's great. So we need to think of also defense spending as not a political thing, but it's about building defense capability. It's about building long-term defense capability that can sustain a drawn-out conflict. We used to think, and I was part of doing national defense planning a couple of years ago, that Denmark and NATO, EU side, we just need to last for about 30 days, because then the US would ship in, and then they can sort of take over the fight, right? And as soon as you start to doubt it, just a little bit, then you can't sustain a model where you just have to fight for 30 days, right? It needs to be long, drawn out. And then it becomes a war of attrition. That's what we've seen in Ukraine. And attrition really is, of course, people, but it's also material. So it's a war of defense industrial capability and production. And right now we're losing that war. So one thing is building up defense capabilities as they would seem on a spring day, like on the parade grounds, everything's there. But a few weeks into the conflict, that's not how it's going to look like. I mean, Ukraine is losing about a brigade every week or something, right? I mean, it might be a bit less, but I mean, they are losing tons of people and tons of equipment, and it needs replacement. And we've just not encountered that. I mean, when we were in Afghanistan and someone would get injured or killed, like operation stops. Like it stops. Like it doesn't stop in Ukraine. Like it just continues and it continues. You don't pull out units. I mean, when they're completely depleted, you can pull them out. So yeah, I think Denmark will go down that route of building a more comprehensive defense force, defense force that can do our contributions to NATO on the Eastern Front, survey and maintain situational awareness in the Arctic. It's also one of our key responsibilities, and national defense. So our own borders, our own skies, that's going to be critical for us, and that's some of the larger programs we're working on now. There's both a large naval program that's come out, and we're buying air defense systems as well. So it's going to be the largest defense procurement program that we've ever had. So it's also interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Major Eske, thank you very, very much for that. That was a really, really interesting conversation. We've really enjoyed having you here on the podcast, and we hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. As things evolve and they look to be involving, so I'd be happy to come back.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the European Equation. We certainly enjoyed recording it. If you like our show, please follow us on Spotify and follow us on LinkedIn for more behind-the-scenes content. And if you have anyone who would be interested to be on our show, to talk to us, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on LinkedIn or individually. And I hope you tune in next time.